A story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, truth, and forbidden attraction. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Magnolia Manor, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany floors that gleamed like mirrors reflecting the weight of generations. Isabella Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching the cotton fields stretch endlessly toward the horizon, their white bowls swaying in the humid Georgia breeze like a sea of prosperity built on human suffering. The year was 1858, and the plantation had been in her family for 3 generations, a legacy built on wealth, tradition, and secrets she was only beginning to understand. The manor itself was a testament to Southern grandeur, with its towering white columns, wrap-around verandas, and meticulously maintained gardens that spoke of old money and older sins. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the walls, every crystal chandelier hanging from the coffered ceilings had been purchased with the profits of human bondage. Isabella had grown up surrounded by this luxury, accepting it as her birthright without questioning the foundation upon which it rested. At 26, Isabella had inherited more than just land and property when her father died 2 years prior. She had inherited a world of rigid expectations, unspoken rules, and a burden of responsibility that weighed heavier with each passing day. Her marriage to Charles had been arranged by her father, a union of 2 prominent plantation families designed to consolidate wealth and social standing rather than foster love or companionship. Charles, 15 years her senior, treated her more like a valuable possession than a wife, spending most of his time in Savannah on business ventures that kept him away from Magnolia Manor for weeks at a time. The isolation had become Isabella's constant companion. She moved through the grand rooms of her ancestral home like a ghost, attended by servants who called her ma'am and Mrs. Whitmore but never truly saw her as a person. The enslaved women who dressed her hair and served her meals kept their eyes downcast, their conversations limited to "yes, ma'am" and "no, ma'am," creating a barrier of formality that left Isabella feeling more alone than ever. "Mrs. Whitmore." The voice came from behind her, soft yet commanding in its quiet confidence. Isabella's breath caught as she turned to face Marcus, her personal valet. He stood in the doorway with perfect posture, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that always made her feel exposed, as if he could see through the carefully constructed walls of her privileged existence. Unlike the other enslaved people on the plantation, Marcus never averted his gaze, never seemed to shrink into himself in her presence. There was something almost regal about the way he carried himself, as if he were playing a role rather than living his reality. "Yes, Marcus," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your afternoon tea is ready in the parlor, ma'am. Shall I inform cook that you'll be dining alone again this evening?" There it was, that subtle acknowledgement of her solitude, delivered without judgment but with an understanding that unsettled her. Marcus had been assigned to her service 6 months ago, replacing the elderly Samuel who had served her family since childhood. Samuel had been deferential to the point of invisibility, a fixture in the house who anticipated needs without ever making his presence truly felt. Marcus was different. His presence filled a room, commanded attention even when he was trying to blend into the background. Unlike Samuel's shuffling gait and bent shoulders, Marcus moved with fluid grace, his posture straight and proud despite the circumstances of his bondage. His clothing, though simple and marking his status as property, was always immaculately maintained. His speech, while carefully respectful, carried undertones of education that seemed impossible given his position. Isabella had noticed the way his eyes followed text when she read aloud, the careful way he handled her correspondence, the subtle corrections he made to her pronunciation of French phrases. "Yes, that will be fine," Isabella said, smoothing her emerald silk dress, a garment that cost more than most people earned in a year. "And Marcus?" "Yes, ma'am." "Please ensure the library fire is lit this evening. I'll be reading late." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore." As he turned to leave, Isabella found herself studying the way he moved, graceful, purposeful, as if he belonged in drawing rooms rather than serving them. His shoulders were broad beneath his simple white shirt, his hands elegant and unmarked by the hard labor that scarred most enslaved men. There was something in his bearing that suggested nobility, a quality that seemed to emanate from within rather than being imposed by circumstances. The thought troubled her more than she cared to admit. In her world, enslaved people were supposed to be invisible, interchangeable, defined entirely by their function rather than their individuality. Marcus challenged that comfortable fiction simply by existing, by being impossible to ignore or dismiss. His presence forced Isabella to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of the system that had shaped her entire life. And that evening, Isabella sat in the library, a leather-bound volume of poetry open in her lap, but her mind wandered far from the printed words. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with her father's collection of books, volumes on law, philosophy, and plantation management that now felt like monuments to a world she was beginning to question. The library had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape into other worlds and other lives, but lately, even her beloved books couldn't quiet the restlessness growing within her. The room itself was a masterpiece of masculine elegance, with its dark wood paneling, Persian rugs, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held first editions and rare manuscripts collected over generations. A massive globe stood in one corner, its surface marked with the routes of ships that had carried cotton to distant markets and returned with luxury goods, purchased with the profits of human labor. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she sat surrounded by knowledge and culture built on a foundation of ignorance and cruelty. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Marcus appeared in the doorway carrying a silver tray with her evening brandy, the crystal decanter catching the firelight like liquid amber. "I thought you might need this." The brandy was a nightly ritual, one of the small comforts that helped Isabella endure the loneliness of her evenings. But tonight, as Marcus approached with the tray, she found herself more aware of his presence than the alcohol he carried. The way the firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intelligence in his dark eyes, made her pulse quicken in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the crystal glass. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and Isabella felt an electric shock run through her, a jolt of awareness that seemed to travel from her fingertips to her very core. She pulled her hand back quickly, but not before noticing that Marcus had felt it too. His dark eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he regained his composure, the mask of servitude sliding back into place like a curtain falling across a stage. "Will there be anything else, Mum?" Isabella took a sip of brandy, using the moment to study his face in the firelight. The alcohol burned her throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire that seemed to ignite whenever Marcus was near. There was something aristocratic about his features, high cheekbones that could have graced a portrait in any grand home, a strong jawline that spoke of breeding and refinement, and those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and pain she couldn't fathom. She had begun to notice other things too. The way he held himself when he thought no one was watching, the careful modulation of his voice that suggested he was deliberately suppressing his natural speaking patterns, the fleeting expressions that crossed his face when he looked at the portraits of her ancestors lining the hallway. There were moments when she caught him studying the family paintings with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as if he were searching for something in those painted faces. "Marcus," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence of the library, "where did you learn to read?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, heavy with implications that both of them understood. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Georgia, punishable by severe penalties for both teacher and student. The law was designed to keep the enslaved population ignorant and dependent, to prevent the spread of ideas that might challenge the established order. Yet Isabella had noticed Marcus's eyes following the text when she read aloud, had seen him handle her correspondence with a familiarity that suggested not just literacy, but education. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Whitmore," he replied carefully, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched almost imperceptibly at his sides. "Don't lie to me," Isabella said, her voice softer than her words, but carrying an undertone of steel that surprised them both. "I've seen the way you look at books, the way you organize my papers. Someone taught you, and they taught you well." Marcus remained silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he weighed his options. The fire popped and hissed in the grate, the only sound in a room that suddenly felt charged with dangerous possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Isabella's heart race, a depth of emotion that no enslaved person was supposed to possess. "Knowledge once gained cannot be unknown, ma'am. Sometimes it finds us whether we seek it or not." The cryptic response only deepened Isabella's curiosity and her growing certainty that Marcus was far more than he appeared. She set down her brandy and stood, moving closer to where Marcus stood by the fireplace. The proper distance between mistress and servant seemed to dissolve in the intimate lighting of the library, the social barriers that defined their world becoming as insubstantial as the shadows dancing on the walls. "Who are you, really?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Marcus's composure cracked for just a moment, and Isabella saw something flash in his eyes, pain, longing, and something else she couldn't identify, but that made her breath catch in her throat. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep within him. "I am whoever you need me to be, Mrs. Whitmore." The answer was both everything and nothing, a response that revealed the careful balance he maintained between truth and survival. As Isabella stared into his eyes, she realized that her strange attraction to this man was about more than his physical presence or mysterious demeanor. It was about the way he made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life, not as a plantation mistress or a wealthy widow, but as a woman struggling with questions she didn't know how to ask and yearning for connections she didn't know how to make. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and dangerous desires. Isabella could feel her heart pounding, could sense that they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the impropriety, the danger, the impossibility of what she was feeling. But another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, whispered that some truths were worth any risk. "Good night, Marcus," she said finally, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." As he left the library, Isabella sank back into her chair, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. In their world, the attraction she felt was not just inappropriate, it was dangerous, potentially deadly for both of them. The laws governing relationships between white women and enslaved men were brutal and unforgiving, designed to maintain the racial hierarchy that kept the plantation system functioning. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was hiding something far more significant than his ability to read. There was a mystery surrounding him that went beyond his education or his bearing, something that called to her like a siren song. As she sat alone in the library, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of generations, Isabella felt the first stirrings of a truth that would soon shatter everything she thought she knew about her world, her family, and herself. Outside, the Georgia night was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant voices from the slave quarters, the everyday sounds of a plantation settling into evening routine. But inside the grand library of Magnolia Manor, Isabella closed her eyes and tried to push away the growing certainty that her carefully ordered world was about to change forever, that the man who served her evening brandy held secrets that would transform not just her understanding of him, but her understanding of everything she had ever believed about herself and her family. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream, and Isabella found herself creating increasingly elaborate excuses to spend time in Marcus's presence. She requested his assistance with correspondence that she could easily handle herself, asked him to reorganize the library according to new systems that served no purpose beyond keeping him near, and lingered over conversations that should have been brief and formal. Each interaction only deepened her fascination and her growing sense that there was far more to Marcus than met the eye. The morning routines of Magnolia Manor had taken on new significance for Isabella. She would position herself in rooms where she knew Marcus would appear, timing her activities to coincide with his duties. She began to notice details that had previously escaped her attention, the way he moved through the house with an almost proprietary familiarity, as if he belonged there in ways that transcended his role as property. She observed how the other enslaved people deferred to him with a respect that went beyond his position as personal valet to the mistress, how they sought his counsel on matters both practical and personal. The plantation's social hierarchy was complex and carefully maintained, with house servants ranking above field hands and personal servants to the family occupying the highest positions among the enslaved population. But Marcus seemed to exist outside this system entirely, commanding respect through some quality that had nothing to do with his assigned role. Isabella had begun to notice the way conversations stopped when he approached, the way eyes followed him with a mixture of admiration and something that looked almost like recognition. The morning sun streamed through the breakfast room windows as Isabella reviewed the plantation's accounts. The ledger book spread across the polished mahogany table like accusations written in ink and numbers. The figures told a story of prosperity built on human suffering, a reality she had always known but never truly confronted until Marcus's presence began forcing her to see her world through different eyes. Each entry represented lives bought and sold, families separated, children born into bondage. The neat columns of profit and loss suddenly seemed obscene in their clinical detachment from the human cost they represented. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Marcus entered, carrying the Morning Post, his movements as graceful as always, but somehow more purposeful today. These arrived from Savannah. Among the letters was one bearing her husband's familiar seal, the wax impression of the Whitmore family crest that had once filled her with pride, but now seemed like a brand marking her complicity in a system she was beginning to question. Isabella's stomach tightened as she broke the wax and unfolded Charles's familiar handwriting, each word written in the confident script of a man who had never doubted his place in the world or questioned the foundations of his privilege. "My dear Isabella, business continues to detain me in Savannah longer than anticipated. The cotton market remains volatile, and I am negotiating several contracts that will secure our financial position for the coming year. I expect to return to Magnolia Manor within the fortnight, perhaps sooner if circumstances permit. I trust you are managing the estate with your usual efficiency. I have heard concerning reports about unrest among the enslaved population in neighboring counties, rumors of escape attempts, and even whispers of organized resistance. Ensure our people remain content and productive. Any sign of discontent should be dealt with swiftly and decisively. I've also received inquiries about our new valet from several acquaintances who have visited recently. They speak highly of his bearing and capabilities, perhaps too highly. Remember that exceptional slaves often become problematic slaves. Do not allow familiarity to breed contempt for proper order. Your devoted husband." Charles. Isabella set the letter aside, her hands trembling slightly as the implications of Charles's words sank in. Her husband's return would mean the end of these stolen moments of connection with Marcus, the return to a marriage that felt more like a business arrangement than a union of hearts. But more troubling was his mention of inquiries about Marcus, the suggestion that others had noticed something unusual about her valet. In a world where conformity was survival, standing out could be deadly. "Bad news, ma'am?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with intelligence that missed nothing. Isabella looked up to find him studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained facade. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything, a choice born of desperation, longing, and a growing need to understand the mystery that surrounded this man who had turned her ordered world upside down. "Marcus, walk with me in the garden." "Ma'am, I don't think—" That wasn't a request. The garden behind Magnolia Manor was Isabella's private sanctuary, a carefully cultivated paradise that represented the pinnacle of southern horticultural achievement. Ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss created natural alcoves of privacy, their massive trunks and spreading branches forming cathedral-like spaces where secrets could be shared without fear of observation. The scent of jasmine and magnolia blossoms filled the warm air, competing with the heady perfume of roses that climbed trellises and spilled over garden walls in cascades of color and fragrance. Gravel paths wound between carefully tended beds of camellias, azaleas, and gardenias, each plant chosen and positioned to create a symphony of color and scent that changed with the seasons. Marble statues imported from Italy stood at strategic points throughout the garden, their classical forms adding an air of European sophistication to the distinctly southern landscape. A fountain carved from Georgia marble provided the gentle sound of flowing water, its basin filled with water lilies that floated like stars on the dark surface. They walked in silence for several minutes, the proper distance between them gradually diminishing until they were walking side by side like equals, rather than mistress and servant. Isabella could feel the tension radiating from Marcus, could sense his awareness of how dangerous this moment was for both of them. In the slave quarters, such proximity between a white woman and an enslaved man would be noted and reported. In the garden, surrounded by the privacy of ancient trees and flowering shrubs, they could speak freely for perhaps the first time since he had arrived at Magnolia Manor. The morning air was thick with humidity and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms, the kind of weather that made clothing cling to skin and thoughts turn to forbidden possibilities. Isabella was acutely aware of Marcus's presence beside her, of the way his breathing had quickened, of the careful distance he maintained even as they walked together through her private sanctuary. "My husband returns soon," Isabella said finally, stopping beside the marble fountain that had been a wedding gift from her father, a symbol of purity and eternal love that now seemed like a mockery of her loveless marriage. "I see," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the tension that thrummed beneath the surface. "Do you?" Isabella turned to face him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Do you see what this means?" Marcus met her gaze, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore slipped away entirely. Isabella saw raw emotion in his eyes, desire, pain, and something that looked like desperation. The sight of such unguarded feeling in a man who had learned to hide every thought and emotion for his own survival made her breath catch in her throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Isabella interrupted, stepping closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and something uniquely him. "I'm simply stating a fact. My husband returns, and these conversations we've been having will end." "They should end," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Isabella could see the war being fought behind his eyes. Duty against desire, survival against truth. "Should they?" Isabella reached out, her fingers barely grazing his hand where it rested at his side. The touch sent electricity through both of them, a jolt of connection that seemed to bridge the impossible gulf between their worlds. "Tell me, Marcus, what do you see when you look at me?" The question hung between them like a challenge, like a dare that could destroy them both if answered honestly. Marcus's breathing became shallow, and Isabella could see the internal battle raging behind his eyes, the struggle between the truth he wanted to speak and the lies that kept them both safe. "I see a woman trapped in a cage of gold," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion that he could no longer contain. "I see someone who questions everything, but is afraid to challenge anything. I see someone who has been taught to value herself only in relation to others, as daughter, as wife, as mistress, but never as herself." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, each one stripping away another layer of the protective fiction she had built around her life. No one had ever seen her so clearly, had ever suggested that she could be anything other than what society expected. In that moment, standing in the dappled sunlight of her garden, with the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, Isabella felt something inside her break free, a part of herself that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed. "And what do you see for yourself?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle splash of the fountain. Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. He stepped back as if she had struck him, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as years of carefully controlled emotion threatened to overwhelm him. "I see a man who should know better than to want what he can never have," he said, his voice filled with anguish that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "I see someone whose very existence is a lie, whose presence here puts everyone in danger." "What do you mean?" Isabella pressed, sensing that she was finally approaching the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of deception and careful performance. What lie, Marcus? But Marcus had already begun rebuilding his walls, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door slamming shut. He straightened his shoulders and assumed the deferential posture expected of his position, the transformation so complete it was like watching one person disappear and another take his place. "Forgive me, Mrs. Whitmore. I spoke out of turn. It won't happen again." "Marcus, please." "I should return to my duties, ma'am." As he walked away, leaving Isabella alone by the fountain with its gentle music and floating lilies, she felt a mixture of frustration and growing certainty that Marcus was hiding something far more significant than his feelings for her. His words echoed in her mind like a riddle she couldn't solve, whose very existence is a lie. The afternoon passed in a haze of restless energy as Isabella tried to focus on her usual activities, reviewing household accounts, meeting with the cook about menu planning, supervising the arrangement of flowers cut fresh from the garden. But her mind kept returning to Marcus's words, to the pain she had seen in his eyes, to the growing conviction that there was a mystery surrounding him that went far beyond his education or his bearing. That evening, Isabella found herself in her father's study, a room she had avoided since his death 2 years prior. The heavy mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The walls were lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch her with disapproval as she violated the sanctity of what had been her father's private domain. The desk drawers were filled with documents related to the plantation's operation. Purchase records, bills of sale, correspondence with slave traders, and financial records that detailed the business of human bondage with clinical precision. Isabella had never examined these papers closely, leaving such matters to her husband and the overseer, content to live in ignorance of the mechanisms that sustained her comfortable life. But now, driven by a need to understand Marcus's cryptic words and the mystery that surrounded him, she began searching through the files with growing desperation. Each document she examined painted a picture of the plantation's operations that was both familiar and horrifying. The casual buying and selling of human beings, the separation of families, the reduction of people to mere entries in a ledger book. It was in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of routine correspondence, that she found it. A leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon and marked with her father's personal seal. Inside were documents that made her blood run cold, birth certificates, death records, and a letter in her father's distinctive handwriting that began with words that would haunt her forever. The boy must never know the truth of his parentage. Isabella's hands shook as she read the letter by lamplight, each word reshaping her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her family, her plantation, and the man who had been serving her with such quiet dignity. The truth was more shocking than anything she could have imagined, and as she sat in the lamplight reading her father's confession, Isabella realized that Marcus's revelation, when it came, would change not just her world, but everything she believed about herself and the foundations upon which her entire life had been built. The next morning dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the confrontation Isabella knew she could no longer avoid. She had spent the night reading and rereading her father's letter, each word burning itself into her memory until she could recite the terrible truth by heart. The leather portfolio lay open on her desk like an accusation, its contents spread before her in damning detail. The letter was dated 15 years earlier, written in her father's careful script on paper, bearing the Whitmore family crest. But it was the content that had shattered Isabella's world, revealing secrets that explained so much about Marcus's bearing, his education, his mysterious presence at Magnolia Manor. The truth was more complex and devastating than she could have imagined, a web of lies and hidden relationships that stretched back to her childhood. Isabella had barely slept, her mind racing as she tried to process the implications of what she had discovered. The man she had been drawn to, the servant whose presence had awakened feelings she didn't understand, was connected to her family in ways that made her attraction both impossible and deeply disturbing. The revelation changed everything, not just her understanding of Marcus, but her understanding of her father, her family, and the foundations of her entire world. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil in her heart as she prepared for the confrontation that could no longer be delayed. She dressed carefully in a simple morning gown of deep blue silk, her hands trembling as she arranged her hair and tried to compose herself for what was to come. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was pale and drawn, marked by a night of revelation and the terrible weight of truth. Isabella waited in the library, the leather portfolio open on the desk before her, like evidence in a trial that would determine both their fates. The room that had been her sanctuary now felt like a courtroom, its walls lined with books that seemed to watch her with silent judgment. The fire crackled in the grate, but its warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. When Marcus arrived with her morning tea, she could see the surprise in his eyes at finding her surrounded by the documents she had discovered. His usual composure faltered for just a moment as he took in the scene. The open portfolio, the scattered papers, the expression on her face that told him his carefully guarded secrets were about to be exposed. "Close the door," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the papers on the desk, before meeting her gaze. She could see him calculating, weighing his options, perhaps considering whether he could somehow deflect or deny what was about to unfold. But there was resignation in his posture too, as if part of him was relieved that the charade was finally coming to an end. "Sit down," Isabella said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think—" "Sit down." The authority in her voice was absolute. But it was tempered with something Marcus had never heard before, a kind of desperate vulnerability that made him comply despite every instinct telling him to flee. He moved to the chair with his usual grace, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests as if anchoring himself for what was to come. Isabella picked up her father's letter, her hands trembling slightly as she began to read aloud. The words seemed to echo in the quiet library, each syllable falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. "The boy must never know the truth of his parentage. What happened between myself and Celeste was a moment of weakness that has produced a complication I cannot acknowledge publicly. The child shows intelligence beyond his station and bears an unfortunate resemblance to our family line. I have arranged for his education in secret, but he must remain among the enslaved population for the safety of all involved." Marcus's face had gone ashen, but he remained silent as Isabella continued reading, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed to burn. She could see the pain in his expression, the way her words were stripping away the carefully constructed barriers he had built around the truth of his existence. "Should anything happen to me, I trust that Isabella will handle this matter with discretion. The boy, Marcus, is her half-brother, though she must never be told unless circumstances make revelation unavoidable. I have provided for his care and education through intermediaries, but his true identity must remain hidden. The consequences of discovery would be catastrophic for all involved." The letter fell from Isabella's nerveless fingers as she stared across the desk at Marcus, at her half-brother. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with 26 years of lies, secrets, and the terrible irony of the attraction that had been building between them. The air in the library seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of revelation and the implications of what they had both been feeling. Isabella felt as if the world was tilting beneath her feet, as if everything she had believed about herself and her family was crumbling like a house built on sand. The man she had been drawn to, whose presence had awakened longings she didn't understand, was her own blood, a brother she had never known existed, hidden in plain sight by their father's shame and society's cruel laws. "How long have you known?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible in the sudden stillness of the library. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow with pain and years of carefully suppressed emotion. "Since I was 16, Celeste, my mother, told me on her deathbed. She made me promise to never reveal the truth, to never claim what could never be mine." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Isabella could see the weight of that secret in Marcus's eyes, could imagine the burden of growing up knowing he was the son of the master, but could never acknowledge that relationship, could never claim the privileges that should have been his birthright. But you came here anyway. You requested assignment to this house. I had to see you, Marcus said, his composure finally cracking completely as years of suppressed emotion threatened to overwhelm him. I had to know what kind of person my sister was, whether you were like him, whether you saw people like me as property or as human beings. Isabella felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full implications of his words sank in. Everything she had felt, everything she had imagined between them, was suddenly revealed as something twisted and impossible. The attraction that had seemed so forbidden was now revealed as something far worse, a cruel joke played by fate and genetics, a connection that could never be acknowledged or acted upon. The education, the way you carry yourself, father arranged for tutors, Marcus said bitterly, his voice filled with a pain that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Paid for by the profits of the plantation, taught in secret by abolitionists who thought they were helping a promising young slave, I learned to read with books bought by the sale of my own people. The irony was devastating. Marcus had been educated with money earned from the enslavement of others like him, given knowledge and refinement that only served to make his bondage more painful. He was trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, educated enough to understand his situation, but powerless to change it. Isabella stood abruptly, pacing to the window as she struggled to process the magnitude of what she had learned. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering strength, and she could see the enslaved workers hurrying to secure the cotton before the rain began. The sight of them, her people as she had always thought of them, now carried new meaning. Among them might be others with hidden connections to her family, other secrets buried beneath the surface of plantation life. All this time, she said, her voice barely audible above the rumble of approaching thunder, I've been feeling, and you've been. Watching my sister struggle with feelings that could have destroyed us both, Marcus finished, his voice raw with emotion. Do you think this has been easy for me? Do you think I haven't seen the way you look at me, haven't felt the same impossible pull? Isabella spun around to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of their situation crashed over her. Then why didn't you tell me? Why let me torture myself with these feelings? Marcus stood, his own eyes bright with unshed tears that he had been holding back for years. Because I hoped that if I could just serve you quietly, if I could just be near you without causing harm, it might be enough. Because I knew that the truth would destroy any chance of whatever this could have been. And what could it have been? Isabella demanded, her voice breaking with the weight of impossible longing. Even if we weren't, even if you weren't your brother, Marcus said, the word falling between them like a stone into deep water. Your enslaved half-brother, whose very existence is a testament to our father's hypocrisy and our family's sins. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the plantation like the voice of an angry god. Isabella sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation and the cruel irony of their situation. The connection she had felt, the attraction that had seemed so powerful and mysterious, was revealed as something that could never be acknowledged or explored. What do we do now? She whispered, her voice lost in the sound of rain against glass. Marcus moved closer, but stopped just short of touching her, a gesture that now carried entirely different meaning. The careful distance he had always maintained suddenly made perfect sense, as did the pain she had sometimes glimpsed in his eyes when he looked at her. We do what we've always done, he said, his voice gentle but firm. We pretend. We maintain the fiction that keeps us both safe. I can't, Isabella said, looking up at him with desperate eyes that reflected her shattered world. I can't pretend anymore, not after this. You have to, Marcus said urgently, his voice carrying the weight of years of survival in a world that would destroy them both for the truth. Your husband returns soon. If he suspects anything, if anyone suspects the truth about my parentage or about what's been happening between us, nothing has happened between us, hasn't it? Marcus's voice was gentle but relentless. We've been walking toward this moment for months, Isabella. We've been falling toward something that was always impossible, always dangerous. The only thing that's changed is that now we know why. Isabella buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. The man she had been drawn to, the connection she had felt, the possibility of something beyond her empty marriage, all of it was revealed as an elaborate cosmic joke, a cruel twist of fate that made their attraction not just forbidden, but fundamentally wrong. "I need time," she said finally, her voice muffled by her hands. "I need to think." "Time is the one thing we don't have," Marcus replied, his voice filled with the urgency of someone who understood the dangers they faced. "Charles returns in less than a week. We need to decide how to handle this before then." Isabella looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a mysterious servant or an object of forbidden desire, but as her brother, a man whose entire life had been shaped by their father's secrets and society's cruelties. The resemblance was there now that she knew to look for it, in the line of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the way he carried himself with unconscious nobility. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier now as she tried to focus on practical matters rather than the emotional devastation of their situation. "If you could have anything, what would you choose?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the storm raging outside the library windows. When he spoke, his voice was filled with a longing that broke Isabella's heart all over again. "I want to be free," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of bondage and hidden identity. "I want to walk away from this place, from these lies, from the weight of being someone I can never acknowledge. I want to find somewhere I can just be Marcus, not a slave, not a secret, not a reminder of our father's sins." "Then we'll find a way," Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with resolve as she focused on something she could actually do for him. "I don't know how, but we'll find a way to give you that freedom." Marcus turned to look at her, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. "Isabella, you don't understand what you're saying. The legal complications alone—" "I'm the mistress of this plantation," Isabella interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of her position for perhaps the first time in her life. "I have more power than I've ever chosen to use. If I can't free my own brother, then what good is any of it?" As the storm raged outside, brother and sister sat in the library, where their father's secrets had finally come to light, planning a future that would require them to challenge everything their world held sacred. The attraction that had brought them to this moment was transformed into something deeper, a bond of family and shared purpose that would either save them both or destroy them completely. The truth had been revealed at a terrible cost, but it had also freed them from the burden of pretense and given them a chance to forge a new kind of relationship, based on honesty rather than deception. Charles Whitmore returned to Magnolia Manor 3 days earlier than expected, his carriage arriving through the storm-soaked grounds just as Isabella and Marcus were finalizing their plans in the library. The sound of wheels on gravel and horses' hooves splashing through puddles announced his arrival like a death knell, shattering the fragile sense of hope that had begun to grow between the siblings as they worked toward Marcus's freedom. Isabella watched from her bedroom window as her husband's familiar figure emerged from the carriage, his face set in the stern expression she knew meant business troubles in Savannah. Charles was a man who wore his authority like armor, his every movement calculated to project power and control. At 41, he had the bearing of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted, never been forced to question the foundations of his privilege. His return meant the end of the careful planning she and Marcus had undertaken, the return to a world of surveillance and suspicion that would make their secret impossible to maintain. She had spent the past 3 days in a whirlwind of activity, consulting with lawyers in nearby Augusta, under the pretense of updating her will, researching the legal procedures for manumission, and quietly liquidating some of her personal assets. The plan she and Marcus had developed was dangerous and complex, requiring careful timing and absolute secrecy. They had identified a network of abolitionists who could help Marcus reach the North, had arranged for funds to support his journey, and had even discussed the possibility of Isabella following him once the scandal of his disappearance had died down. The legal research had been particularly challenging, as the laws governing the freeing of enslaved people were deliberately complex and restrictive. Georgia law required that any enslaved person granted freedom must leave the state within a year. And the process required approval from local courts that were notoriously hostile to manumission. More troubling still, Isabella had discovered that freeing Marcus would require her to publicly acknowledge their relationship, something that would destroy her reputation and potentially put them both in physical danger. But they had found a possible solution through a lawyer in Augusta, who specialized in such cases, a man who had helped other plantation owners navigate the legal complexities of freeing enslaved people. The process would require careful documentation, substantial legal fees, and absolute discretion, but it was possible. Isabella had been prepared to sacrifice everything, her marriage, her social standing, her financial security, to give Marcus the freedom he deserved. "Isabella!" Charles's voice boomed through the house as he entered, his tone carrying the authority of a man who expected immediate attention and absolute obedience. "Where is my wife?" Isabella took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and descended the grand staircase to greet her husband. Charles stood in the foyer, his traveling clothes dusty and his expression thunderous. The contrast between his commanding presence and Marcus's quiet dignity was stark. Where Marcus moved with natural grace, Charles projected power through sheer force of will and social position. "Welcome home, darling," Isabella said, offering her cheek for his perfunctory kiss, the gesture as empty and formal as their entire marriage had become. "You're earlier than expected." "Business concluded sooner than anticipated," Charles replied curtly, his eyes already scanning the house with the calculating gaze of a man who missed nothing. "Cotton prices have stabilized, and I've secured several profitable contracts. I trust everything has been managed properly in my absence." "Of course," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart and the knowledge that her carefully laid plans were about to crumble. "Marcus has been particularly helpful with correspondence and estate matters." At the mention of Marcus's name, Charles's eyes sharpened with an intensity that made Isabella's blood run cold. She could see suspicion forming in his expression, could sense the dangerous turn his thoughts were taking. Charles was a man who had built his fortune on his ability to read people and situations, to identify threats and opportunities with ruthless efficiency. "Marcus?" "The new valet. I want to speak with him immediately." Isabella's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure through years of practice in hiding her true feelings. "Certainly. I'll have him summoned." As if he had been waiting for the cue, and perhaps he had, having heard the commotion of Charles's arrival, Marcus appeared in the doorway. His posture was perfectly deferential, his expression carefully neutral, but Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, could sense the danger crackling in the air between the two men. She marveled at his ability to transform himself back into the role of subservient slave, knowing now the intelligence and pain hidden behind the mask. "You sent for me, sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying none of the warmth and depth Isabella had come to know, instead adopting the flat, emotionless tone expected of his position. Charles studied Marcus with calculating eyes, and Isabella felt her heart racing as she watched her husband's assessment. The resemblance between Marcus and her father seemed so obvious now that she knew to look for it. How had she missed it before? Could Charles see it too? Did he sense the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of their carefully maintained deception? "I've heard interesting reports about you," Charles said slowly, circling Marcus like a predator sizing up its prey. "Apparently, you've been quite courtois involved in estate management during my absence." "I serve as Mrs. Whitmore directs, sir," Marcus replied evenly, his voice betraying nothing of the intelligence and education Isabella knew he possessed. "Indeed," Charles continued his predatory circling, his gaze taking in every detail of Marcus's appearance and bearing. "Tell me, boy, where did you serve before coming to Magnolia Manor?" Isabella held her breath as Marcus delivered the carefully rehearsed story they had prepared months ago when he first arrived, a tale of service on a smaller plantation that had been sold, of being transferred to Magnolia Manor through a network of slave traders and overseers. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, could sense the danger crackling in the air between the two men like electricity before a storm. "I see," Charles said when Marcus finished, his voice carrying undertones of skepticism that made Isabella's heart pound. "And you can read, can't you?" The question hung in the air like a trap, and Isabella felt her breath catch as she watched Marcus calculate his response. Too much literacy would mark him as dangerous, potentially rebellious. Too little would make his usefulness to Isabella suspicious. He had to walk a careful line between competence and compliance. "I know some letters, sir. Enough to help with simple tasks." "Demonstrate," Charles commanded, pulling a letter from his coat pocket with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed exercising power over others. "Read this." Marcus took the letter with steady hands, his eyes scanning the text with what appeared to be careful concentration. Isabella could see him deliberately stumbling over certain words, feigning the limited literacy expected of his position while demonstrating just enough skill to explain his usefulness. It was a masterful performance, but she could see Charles's suspicions growing rather than diminishing. Charles watched intently, his eyes missing nothing as Marcus read. When Marcus finished, Charles retrieved the letter and dismissed him with a curt nod. But Isabella could see her husband's mind working, could sense the dangerous conclusions he was drawing. "Interesting," Charles murmured as Marcus left the room, his voice carrying implications that made Isabella's skin crawl. "Very interesting indeed." That evening, Isabella sat at her dressing table while her lady's maid prepared her for dinner, the familiar routine providing no comfort as she watched Charles pace their bedroom through the mirror. His agitation was evident in every movement, his mind clearly working through some problem that had captured his complete attention. The bedroom itself was a monument to Southern elegance, with its four-poster bed draped in silk curtains, its Persian rugs and French furniture that spoke of wealth and refinement. But tonight, the luxury felt oppressive, like a beautiful prison that trapped Isabella in a life she no longer wanted. The portraits of Whitmore ancestors that lined the walls seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes, as if they knew the secrets she was harboring and the plans she had been making. "Something troubles you, darling?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer and could guess the direction of his thoughts. Charles stopped pacing and fixed her with a penetrating stare that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight through to her guilty conscience. "That valet of yours, there's something not right about him." "Whatever do you mean?" Isabella's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled as she reached for her jewelry, the familiar weight of her pearls providing no comfort against the growing sense of danger. "He's too educated, too refined. No slave should carry himself with such dignity." Charles's voice carried a dangerous edge that Isabella had heard before, usually directed at business rivals or political opponents who had crossed him. "I've made some inquiries about his background." Isabella's blood turned to ice, her reflection in the mirror going pale as the implications of his words sank in. "Inquiries? The story he tells doesn't match the records I've found. There are gaps, inconsistencies." Charles moved closer, his reflection appearing behind hers in the mirror like a dark omen. "I think someone has been lying to us, my dear." Before Isabella could respond, a commotion erupted from somewhere in the house, shouting voices, running footsteps, and then Marcus's voice raised in protest. The sounds carried through the walls of the manor like a death knell, and Isabella leaped to her feet, her heart racing as she realized their time had run out, that whatever trap Charles had been setting was now springing closed around them. Charles was already moving toward the door, his face grim with purpose and satisfaction. "It seems my suspicions were well-founded." Isabella followed her husband downstairs, her silk slippers silent on the polished wood, as they descended into a nightmare she had hoped never to face. In the grand foyer, she found Marcus surrounded by 3 white men she didn't recognize, slave catchers, by their rough appearance and hard eyes. Marcus's hands were bound with rope, and there was blood on his lip where someone had struck him, but his bearing remained proud despite his circumstances. The sight of her brother, bound and bloodied like a common criminal, sent a surge of rage through Isabella that surprised her with its intensity. These men had invaded her home, had laid hands on a member of her family, and were treating him like property to be bought and sold. The injustice of it, the casual cruelty, struck her like a physical blow. "What is the meaning of this?" Isabella demanded, though she could see Charles's satisfied expression and knew the answer would destroy everything she had hoped to accomplish. "It seems our Marcus is a runaway," Charles said coldly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had successfully solved a puzzle. "These gentlemen have been tracking him for months. Apparently, he escaped from a plantation in South Carolina after killing an overseer." "That's not true," Isabella protested. But even as she spoke, she could see the trap closing around them. The story was too convenient, too perfectly designed to justify whatever Charles planned to do. The slave catchers stood with the casual confidence of men who had done this many times before, their presence lending credibility to Charles's accusations. Marcus met her eyes across the room, and in that moment, Isabella saw him make a decision that would haunt her forever. Instead of maintaining his innocence, instead of continuing the charade that had protected them both, he straightened his shoulders and spoke with the dignity and authority of his true heritage. The transformation was startling. The deferential slave disappeared, replaced by a man who carried himself like the aristocrat he truly was. "My name is Marcus Whitmore," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the room like a bell tolling the end of their carefully constructed world. "I am the son of Jonathan Whitmore and Celeste, and I am the half-brother of Isabella Whitmore. I have never been to South Carolina, and I have killed no one." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of Isabella's heart pounding in her ears. She watched as Charles's face went through a series of expressions: shock, understanding, and then a cold fury that made her blood run cold. The slave catchers looked confused, their simple narrative of a runaway slave suddenly complicated by claims of family connection and legitimate birth. "Impossible," Charles whispered. But Isabella could see that he was already connecting the pieces, seeing the resemblance that had been hidden in plain sight, understanding the implications of what Marcus had just revealed. "Check the records," Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the danger he had just placed himself in by revealing the truth. "Check my father's private papers. The truth is all there." Charles turned to Isabella, his eyes blazing with accusation and a fury that seemed to fill the entire room. "You knew." It wasn't a question, and Isabella found she couldn't lie anymore, couldn't maintain the pretense that had become too heavy to bear. The weight of secrets and deception had finally become unbearable, and she felt a strange sense of relief as she prepared to speak the truth that would destroy her world. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying across the foyer like a confession. "I knew." The admission seemed to break something fundamental in Charles. His face contorted with rage as he struck Isabella across the face, the blow sending her stumbling backward into the wall. The sound of the slap echoed through the foyer like a gunshot, and Isabella felt blood on her lip as she struggled to maintain her balance. "You knew and you said nothing," he roared, his voice echoing through the grand foyer with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of Magnolia Manor. "You let me be made a fool of in my own house." Marcus strained against his bonds, his own fury evident as he watched Isabella fall, the careful control he had maintained for so long finally cracking under the sight of his sister being struck. "Don't touch her." "I'll do whatever I please with my wife," Charles snarled, turning back to Marcus with eyes that blazed with a hatred that went beyond mere anger. "And as for you, bastard or not, you're still property, and property that has forgotten its place needs to be reminded." What followed was the longest night of Isabella's life. Charles confined her to her room while he dealt with Marcus, posting one of the slave catchers outside her door to ensure she couldn't interfere. The sounds that drifted up from the plantation's punishment quarters would haunt her dreams forever. The crack of whips, the sound of chains, and worst of all, the occasional cry of pain that Marcus couldn't suppress, despite his determination to maintain his dignity. Isabella pounded on her locked door until her fists were bloody, screamed until her voice was raw, and finally collapsed in exhausted despair as dawn broke over Magnolia Manor. The room that had been her sanctuary now felt like a prison, its luxury mocking her helplessness as she listened to her brother being tortured for the crime of claiming his heritage. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, each sound from outside making Isabella's heart race with fear for Marcus's life. She had heard stories of what happened to enslaved people who were accused of uppity behavior, had seen the results of Charles's anger when he felt his authority was challenged. The thought of Marcus enduring such treatment because of their father's secrets and her own inability to protect him filled her with a rage and despair unlike anything she had ever experienced. When Charles finally allowed her out the next morning, Isabella found Marcus in the plantation's infirmary, barely conscious and bearing the marks of a brutal beating that had been designed not just to punish, but to break his spirit. The sight of her brother, broken and bloodied for the crime of claiming his heritage, shattered something fundamental in Isabella's soul. Marcus lay on a rough cot, his back a map of welts and cuts, his face swollen beyond recognition. But when he saw her enter, his eyes, though blackened and nearly swollen shut, still held the spark of defiance that no amount of physical punishment could extinguish. The sight of him, proud even in his suffering, filled Isabella with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm her. "This is what happens," Charles said coldly, standing beside her as she knelt by Marcus's bedside, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he had restored proper order to his world. "When the natural order is challenged, he will recover, and then he will be sold, far away, where his delusions of grandeur can't infect anyone else." "You can't," Isabella whispered, taking Marcus's hand in hers, feeling the calluses and cuts that marked his suffering. "He's my brother." "He's a slave who has forgotten his place," Charles replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned the foundations of his world. "And you're a wife who has forgotten hers. Both situations will be corrected." As Isabella sat beside Marcus's broken form, she realized that their plan for his freedom had failed catastrophically. But looking into her brother's swollen eyes, she saw something that gave her hope, a determination that hadn't been broken, despite the physical punishment he had endured. The beating had been meant to crush his spirit, to reduce him to the subservient slave Charles expected him to be, but it had failed. Marcus remained unbroken, his dignity intact despite his suffering. "This isn't over," she whispered to him, her voice too low for Charles to hear but carrying all the determination and love she felt for the brother she had only recently discovered. Marcus squeezed her hand weakly, and in that small gesture, Isabella found the strength to begin planning again. The truth had been revealed at a terrible cost, but it had also freed them from the burden of pretense. Now they could fight openly for what was right, even if it meant challenging everything their world held sacred. The battle for Marcus's freedom and Isabella's soul was just beginning. Charles might have won this round, but Isabella was no longer the compliant wife who had accepted her place without question. The woman who emerged from that infirmary was someone new, someone who understood that some truths were worth any sacrifice, and some fights were worth fighting regardless of the cost. 6 months later. The morning mist clung to the Hudson River as Isabella stood on the deck of the steamboat Northern Star, watching the New York shoreline grow larger with each passing moment. The city rose before them like a promise of new beginnings, its buildings and spires reaching toward a sky that seemed brighter and more hopeful than any she had seen in Georgia. Beside her, Marcus leaned heavily on a walking stick, his body still bearing the scars of that terrible night at Magnolia Manor, but his eyes bright with something Isabella had never seen before: hope. The months following Charles's discovery had been a nightmare of legal battles, social ostracism, and personal sacrifice that had tested every fiber of Isabella's being. She had used every resource at her disposal, calling in favors from her father's old business associates, liquidating assets with ruthless efficiency, and ultimately sacrificing her marriage and social standing to secure Marcus's freedom. The process had been more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined, requiring her to navigate a legal system designed to prevent exactly what she was trying to accomplish. The divorce had been scandalous enough to make headlines in newspapers from Georgia to New York. The story of a plantation mistress abandoning her husband to free her enslaved half-brother, becoming the kind of tale that fed the growing tensions between North and South. Isabella had become a symbol, to some, of moral courage and Christian duty, to others, of dangerous radicalism that threatened the very foundations of Southern society. Her name was spoken in drawing rooms across the South with a mixture of admiration and horror, depending on the speaker's views on slavery and women's proper roles. The legal proceedings had been particularly brutal, with Charles fighting every step of the way to prevent Marcus's manumission and to maintain control over Isabella's inheritance. He had hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who specialized in protecting the interests of plantation owners and who viewed Isabella's actions as a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system of slavery. The courtroom battles had been vicious, with Isabella's character and sanity called into question, her motives dissected and dismissed as the hysteria of a woman who had been unduly influenced by abolitionist propaganda. But Isabella had persevered, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had sold jewelry, artwork, and even portions of her inheritance to pay for legal fees and to establish a fund for Marcus's support once he reached the North. The process had stripped away not just her wealth, but her illusions about the world she had grown up in, forcing her to confront the brutal realities of a system she had once accepted, without question. The social consequences had been equally devastating. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, invitations to social events ceased entirely, and she found herself ostracized from the only society she had ever known. The women who had once competed for her attention now whispered about her behind fans and closed doors, their conversations a mixture of pity and condemnation for a woman who had thrown away everything for the sake of a slave. But perhaps the most difficult part had been watching Marcus endure the aftermath of his beating and the continued threats from Charles and his allies. There had been attempts to kidnap Marcus and sell him to slave traders in other states, efforts to have him declared mentally incompetent, and constant surveillance that made every day a struggle for survival. Isabella had been forced to hire bodyguards and to move Marcus between safe houses while the legal proceedings dragged on, never knowing if each day might be their last together. "Regrets?" Marcus asked softly, his voice carrying on the river breeze as they watched the bustling harbor of New York approach. Isabella considered the question seriously, as she had many times during the long months of struggle. She had lost everything: her home, her marriage, her place in society, most of her fortune. She would never again be welcomed in the drawing rooms of Savannah or invited to the grand balls of Charleston. Her name would be whispered with scandal and disapproval for generations, a cautionary tale about what happened to women who forgot their place and challenged the natural order. But she had also gained something invaluable, a sense of purpose and moral clarity that had been missing from her life of comfortable privilege. For the first time, she felt that her actions mattered, that she was living according to her own values rather than simply accepting what society expected of her. "None," she said finally, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly free." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face and revealing glimpses of the man he might have been if he had grown up free. The physical marks of his beating were still visible, would always be visible, but they had not broken his spirit or diminished his dignity. If anything, the ordeal had strengthened his resolve and clarified his sense of purpose. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about the future they were both facing. Isabella pulled her shawl closer against the morning chill, her eyes fixed on the approaching city, where they would both begin new lives far from the plantation society that had shaped and constrained them. "I've been corresponding with some abolitionists in Boston. They need someone with inside knowledge of plantation operations to help with their work, someone who understands how the system works and can help others escape it." The prospect both thrilled and terrified her. She would be using her knowledge of Southern society to work against it, helping to undermine the very system that had created her wealth and privilege. It was a complete reversal of everything she had been raised to believe, but it felt right in a way that her old life never had. "And I've been offered a position with a newspaper here in New York," Marcus said, his voice carrying pride and anticipation. "It seems my unique perspective on slavery has value to those fighting against it. They want me to write about my experiences, to help Northern readers understand what slavery really means for those who endure it." The idea of Marcus using his education and eloquence to fight against the system that had oppressed him filled Isabella with fierce pride. He would be giving voice to the voiceless, using his privileged position as an educated former slave to challenge the comfortable assumptions of those who had never experienced bondage firsthand. They stood in comfortable silence as the steamboat approached the dock, both lost in thoughts of the journey that had brought them here. The attraction that had first drawn them together had been transformed into something deeper and more lasting, a bond forged in truth and sacrifice that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. They were no longer mistress and slave, no longer even the confused siblings who had discovered their relationship in a moment of revelation. They were partners in a cause larger than themselves, united by shared purpose and mutual respect. "Isabella," Marcus said as the boat's whistle announced their arrival, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured together, "I want you to know that what you did, the choice you made, it gave me more than freedom. It gave me back my humanity." Isabella turned to look at her brother, seeing in his face the echo of their father's features, but also something entirely his own, a strength and dignity that no amount of oppression had been able to break. The resemblance that had once troubled her now filled her with pride, a visible reminder of the family bond that had survived slavery, secrecy, and violence. "We gave each other that," she replied, her voice steady with conviction. "We chose truth over comfort, justice over security. Whatever comes next, we'll face it as family." As they disembarked into the bustling chaos of New York Harbor, Isabella felt the weight of her old life falling away like discarded chains. The woman who had once been the mistress of Magnolia Manor was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true freedom could only be achieved when it was shared, that privilege meant nothing if it wasn't used to help others. The harbor was alive with activity, ships arriving from distant ports, immigrants beginning new lives, merchants and laborers building the commercial empire that was transforming America. It was a world of possibility and change, where a person's worth was measured by their actions rather than their birth, where the future mattered more than the past. Behind them, the steamboat's whistle echoed across the water, a sound that seemed to carry both farewell and promise. Ahead lay uncertainty, struggle, and the hard work of building new lives in a world that was itself changing rapidly. The fight against slavery was intensifying, and Isabella knew that the choices she and Marcus had made would place them at the center of that struggle. But for the first time since that afternoon, when she had first noticed her valet's penetrating gaze, Isabella Whitmore felt truly alive. The price of truth had been higher than she could have imagined, but the freedom it had purchased for both of them was worth everything she had sacrificed. They had chosen love over law, justice over comfort, and in doing so had discovered who they truly were beneath the roles society had assigned them. In the distance, church bells began to ring, welcoming the new day and the new lives that would be built in its light. The sound carried across the water like a benediction, blessing their journey and the choices that had brought them to this moment of hope and possibility. What an incredible journey of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Isabella's choice to abandon everything for truth and justice shows us that real freedom sometimes requires the greatest sacrifices. Her transformation from a compliant plantation mistress to a fierce advocate for justice reminds us that we all have the power to choose who we become, regardless of how we began. If this story moved you as much as it moved me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Isabella's position? Would you have had the courage to sacrifice everything for what's right? How do you think their story continued in New York? Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey through one of the most challenging periods in American history. Until next time, remember that the most powerful stories are often about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when faced with impossible situations. Sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from what we gain, but from what we're willing to give up for those we love. Subscribe now for more incredible stories that will challenge your heart and mind.